I didn't exactly have the same high school experience as everyone else did. I didn't go to public school, or military school, or vocational academy, or anything like that. Instead, I joined a cult. Or, in other words, I went to a Christian fundamentalist high school. Now, not to be confused with non-denominational Christianity or Catholicism, Christian fundamentalism is where you get a lot more of the radical ideas. They're the people that stand on the street corners with their picket signs screaming fire, damnation, and all of these horrible threats to you because you decided to wear the wrong piece of clothing that day. That's fundamentalism. And I have to be honest, despite going to a school run by these people, as horrible as that might sound, I have to admit it wasn't an entirely negative experience. I met a lot of really good friends who were on the religiously moderate side. I played several leading roles in theater. I played tennis. I had a lot of really great experiences, but there was always this oppressive religious aspect that permeated the entire culture that more often than not hindered my experience rather than help it. Now, I should say, I'm not at all against the study of religion. I think you have the right and freedom to believe and practice whatever religion you would choose. But the version of Christianity that they were teaching ranged from logically questionable to morally quite objectionable. I can remember one time in particular, I was in Old Testament Bible study class. Well, I'll let you figure out what the subject matter of that one was. And we had just finished reading the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt and out of captivity. This prompted the teacher to teach us what freedom meant in the biblical context. She did this with a specific example. She pulled out a fishbowl with a little toy fish inside, sat it on the counter and said, "Class, that's freedom." Well, when most of the class, myself included, were visibly quite perplexed, she decided to elaborate on this. She basically said that we are the fish. The bowl itself are the rules and restrictions placed forth on us by God, and the space inside the bowl, that's freedom. In other words, we were free to do whatever we wanted so long as it conforms to the rules and restrictions put forth on us by God. And just like a fish out of water, should we ever leave these boundaries, we would die. Now, fun fact, there are currently around 500 million people on this planet that identify themselves as atheists who are happy, healthy, and by all intents and purposes, alive. And they might have a contention or two with this sermon. But I too had my own contention. What this sermon essentially boiled down to is that we were free to live in confinement, which, beyond being a blatant oxymoron, was noticeably untrue. And not a single person in the class was asking a question about it. So, I did the smartest thing that you can do when you're surrounded by radical ideologues. I asked questions. I threw my hand up and I said, "Mrs. O'Hare, how are you going to go out there and tell me that freedom is the same thing as confinement? How does that work?" Well, I don't know if you've seen images of Mount St. Helens erupting, but the reaction I got was quite something. We started arguing back and forth, point after point. I would ask a good question, she would respond in kind. She would ask a tough question, I would respond in kind. This was a big argument. So big that when she realized that there was no convincing me of this issue, she called in the headmaster to come silence me. This was not serious. Not only was this the head of the entire school that she was calling in, this was also her husband. If there was anyone with the authority to tell me to just shut up and not ask questions, it was him. And that's exactly what happened. He declared, "William, there is no morality that can be found outside of the Bible. These rules are for your own good, and you will obey them. I will hear no more of it." So that was that. It was by no means the last contention I had with the material, but at this point, I was worried if I tried anything like that again, I might be expelled. But this argument kept ringing in my ears. Here I am almost 10 years after the situation, still arguing with her in my head. What was it about this discussion that bothered me so much? Was it the pure absurdity of the argument itself? The fact that I was silenced by the administration? The fact no one was asking questions? Simply burgeoning adolescence? Well, maybe. It could have been one or all of those things, if I'm being perfectly honest. But the one thing that might explain it happened to be the one thing I was most afraid of. What if she was right? Now, I don't mean, what if people start dying because they don't follow the Bible? What I mean is there a definition of freedom that fits this mold? I thought about it. Thought about it for a long time. Sure enough, I think I found it. It's the Constitution of the United States. Now, on its surface level, it's the foundational document for our governing body. But what does that mean to any of us? We as Americans have an issue where we're so culturally isolated that we never realize just how unique our form of government actually is. Before our country's founding, the main forms of government out there were things like oligarchy, monarchy, theocracy, tyranny. Essentially, one person or several people would gather together, decide what was good and what the laws would be, and you, the citizen, simply had to obey it. And you, as the citizen, were then free to do whatever you would like, as long as it conforms to the rules and restrictions put forth on you by your monarch. And should you ever leave these restrictions, you would die. Does it sound familiar? It's exactly like the fishbowl. Well, that's what's so unique about the Constitution. It does the exact opposite. Think about the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment promises the right to freedom of speech, practice of whatever religion you choose, and the right to gather. That doesn't sound like a rule put forth for people. What about the Second Amendment? That promises in the name to self-defense and resistance to tyranny, all citizens have the right to bear arms. What sort of government would allow for a rule like that? The Third Amendment states that in times of peace or war, no soldier is allowed to take residence in a person's home. Well, by that logic, it would seem that the people have more power than the government. The Fourth Amendment prevents unlawful searches and seizures. Are you noticing a pattern? The whole Constitution and Bill of Rights is an example of this. But the bottom line is that the Constitution is not the law. It is not a set of rules and restrictions put forth on the people. Rather, it is a set of rules and restrictions put forth on the government so that they cannot enact their tyrannical will over the people, thus ensuring liberty, freedom, and prosperity. The government is the one in the fishbowl. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights are the bowl itself. And should the government ever leave these boundaries, democracy, and the democratic republic as we know it, is what dies. And in its place, tyranny arises. When I came to this conclusion, I was overwhelmed with a feeling of peace. I felt that I could finally let this argument I had all those years ago go to rest. My teacher, she was right, in a roundabout sort of way. Although she was perhaps wrong about who should be in the fishbowl. Because of this, I will never know what sort of hardships I've avoided. But I can see it every day. You turn on the news to any channel, you can see women in the Middle East protesting against an oppressive regime that will not stand for them. Or what about the protesters of Hong Kong, who were singing the Star-Spangled Banner before their government violently cracked down on them? These are people that are starving for the same rights and civil liberties that we take for granted so often today. Well, I, for one, am not going to take mine for granted. Neither should you.
After finishing my last year of middle school, I began the routine transition from middle school to high school. When my parents came to my siblings and I and told us that we were moving from Wisconsin to Arizona, that a routine transition turned into an entire transfer. And while this created a new source of anxiety from my ever so sensitive teenage years, my parents were actually really excited for me. And what were they most excited about? Picking out my classes. See, while I was growing up and finding the mind of my own, my parents always considered me way too argumentative. Of course, I don't only argue over small things, like clothes I wanted to wear, or had them to buy me concert tickets. I never considered myself an argumentative kid. When it was finally time to meet the high school counselor, she started by going over the classes that every freshman would take. English, biology, and algebra. But when she got to extracurriculars, and she listed speech and debate as an option, my parents jumped at the opportunity to make me a debater. Now, going to high school in the late 2010s into the early 2020s, it was always infamous to some of my peers and I that something was within our constitutional rights. Whether it was yelling a curse word during an argument or demanding to have a certain grade of teachers. And because I had began to take speech and debate as an extracurricular, I began to learn everything about the Constitution, domestic tranquility, which is a government's duty to protect its citizens, as well as human rights issues. In speech and debate, we use the Constitution or the affirmation to bring it to the forefront of our argument, or in the negation, to show how the Constitution and the affirmation's argument didn't quite run out. We argued over topics like whether or not civil disobedience in the United States of America was justified, or whether or not universal basic income should be implemented. But our topic always went back to the Constitution, human rights, and whether or not this was justified to our domestic tranquility. While a lot of high schoolers actually understood that speech and debate was for a shiny trophy, by the end of my first semester, I had always managed to take my arguments personally. By the end of the semester, I was completely engulfed in debating with anyone and anyone I could about speech and debate topics, human rights, and the Constitution. It was then that I understood that in the United States of America, anything and everything flows in and out of the Constitution. While many people might actually understand what these complex texts of the Constitution mean, it's what my peers and I in the Generation Z might call not very user-friendly. In fact, I didn't actually understand what the Constitution meant to me until I was 16 watching my first protest. When I had got home from school that day, my mom had turned on the documentary. When she turned on the documentary, I immediately saw people protesting, and it just looked like angry people demanding things. I heard about this incident concerning Sandra Bland. Sandra Bland was a Black woman who was smoking a cigarette and driving her car when she was pulled over for a routine traffic stop. During this traffic stop, the police officer told her to get out of her car, to which she complied. It was then that he had slammed Sandra to the pavement, which had broken her wrist, and she was taken into the police custody. Sandra then went on to die in police custody. Suddenly, these protesters demanding things angrily started to make sense for me. I immediately began to draw parallels into Sandra's in my life. I was becoming a Black woman, and I was 16, so I had to spend my driver's license. I was always afraid of being pulled over by the police because, quite frankly, I'm not a driver. When you're pulled over by the police for a routine traffic stop, and you're given a ticket of any kind, you're expected to pay for this ticket with money, not with the law. At that time, my mom turned off the TV, and I understood one thing about the Constitution. The Constitution did not protect me. And this was only the beginning of 2020. Not only was this new virus running rapid in the streets of our country, but there was also this impeachment of domestic tranquility that our Constitution rests on. It was simple. Black people were being murdered in America, and there was nothing we could do about it, as well as the fact that there's something America would do about it. There was Botham Jean, who was in his house eating ice cream, and an off-duty police officer had mistaken the home for hers and came in and shot her. There's Breonna Taylor, was arresting in her home. The police officer, as well as many others, came into the home and murdered her. And there was Ahmaud Arbery, who was jogging past the construction site when two white men saw him, grabbed their guns, hunted him down, and murdered him. It was at this time that I understood that the issue went beyond police brutality. Because Ahmaud Arbery's killers were not part of the police system in Georgia, who were friends, the people who were part of the judiciary system in Georgia, the justice for Ahmaud Arbery took a very long time. I understood that because it went beyond police brutality, I recognized that police brutality was just the root that stemmed into a much larger tree. The tree we like to call modern day America. There were actually a few roots to this tree. First, there's police brutality. Then second, there was political indifference, because people were allowed to have the privilege and luxury of ignoring the situation that was happening. And finally, there was political brutality, where legislators were allowed to write legislation that harms marginalized groups. I recognize that not only America cannot protect me, but it would shield me from the pain and the hurt that I felt. It wouldn't shield any Black American or protect any Black American from the troubling time that we were going through. And because of the lack of censoring, desensitizing content on social media platforms, myself, everyone in this room, and the entire United States of America was able to see Black people being murdered to no avail. The rest of 2020 went on like this. The beginning of my senior year started, but I was constantly walking through life as if it was a blur. I was finishing up my senior classes, taking accelerated college courses, and still exercising extracurriculars like tennis and competing virtually for speech and debate. But my mind was always elsewhere. This constant feeling of survivor's guilt sit over my head and every other Black person's head like a cloud. Questions like, who's gonna die today? Am I next? Or how am I even still alive? Then one month, like every other month since the beginning of 2020, I turned on the TV. Only this time, there was something that was different. Of course, Black people were still being murdered, and there was still this virus happening, but there was hope. Legislators in the House and the Senate were finally ready to address the issue that was happening and create change. Protests happening in every major city, yielding lasting results. For people who couldn't leave their homes, they were able to sign and share protests that would help our voices be heard. I immediately took to my phone. I signed every petition that crossed my screen. I helped organize protests in Phoenix, and I argued in every comment section on Instagram about the fact that Black lives matter. So I guess my parents are right. I'm a tad bit argumentative. But arguing is not a bad thing. Our Constitution is meant to protect every one of its citizens, but sometimes the marginalized groups are left behind. And when this happens to us, we are allowed to advocate for these marginalized groups. We are allowed to protest and write to our legislators to make our voice heard. And even more than that, we're allowed to argue.